Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you again. It's really strange because we've just had 18 months of almost unprecedented situation. And I've only done one live talk. All the others have been online, so it's really nice to actually be able to see people and talk to people in the flesh, as it were. Yeah, is that okay? The only other issue with this is that I'm talking about the Wilder Ancholme project, and the idea originally was that I would come and talk to you near the start of the project, whereas in actual fact, this is closer to the end of the project. And we had a launch in Brig and just in time for lockdown. Really good day, I'll show you some pictures of that, and then bang, that was it. So, the Wilder Ancholme project, and supported by the Heritage Lottery, and it's run by the South Yorkshire Biodiversity Research Group, and by the window is one of the two project officers, Lewis. So if you've got any real questions, ask Lewis over the interval. The idea is to have about 40, maybe 30 to 40 minutes first half, take a bit of a natural break, and then 15-20 minutes for a final session. So the Wilder Ancholme, it's slightly embarrassing because a lot of you in this room will know the Ancholme far better than I do, because it's right on your doorstep and it's an absolute hidden treasure. It's a little gem. And what I'm going to talk about tonight really is a concept and things that we've been doing to try and kickstart this concept and get things moving, and put that in a slightly bigger picture as well. I do have some genuine connection to the area because the bigger vision was really to take the entirety of the valley all the way south down to Market Raisin. And my grandparents lived in Market Raisin, so I do have some genuine connection to this fantastic landscape. And I want you to imagine what it would be like if we could turn back the clock to, so it says 1600s, maybe the 1500s, what this amazing valley would have been like. Now you have to also bear in mind that it wouldn't just be the Ancholme Valley, it would be much wider. The Ancholme would run north as it does to the Humber, but the Humber itself was the outpouring of one of the great fenlands of England. The great northern fens. The southern fen is South Lincolnshire, East Anglia, but the northern fen is North Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. And it's almost entirely gone. So you have to sort of use your imagination, go back and imagine what it would be like to have this landscape where in winter at its core there would be something like 500 square miles of wetland. With the 2019 floods, I did quite a lot with actually the home of one of our other project officers who's now moved on, but she was still working with us in different capacities, Jennifer. Her family are farmers in Fish Lake, and I did quite a lot with the Fish Lake community during the 2019 floods. And you have to keep saying, the clue's in the name, Fish Lake. So, if you were able to go back in time to when what is now a very rare animal, the common eel, was so abundant that people would pay their taxes to the church in barrels of eels. And the biomass of eels migrating up the rivers was enough to stop water wheels from turning in early medieval times. That's an awful lot of eels to completely clog up the system. And of course it's all gone. So you have to imagine what it would be like for this amazing river running as an artery from deep in the heart of Lincolnshire out to the Humber, but not the river as it is today. And there's a few little bits of writing from our policies and things that I just wanted to share with you. the vision of the project was a wetter, wilder future, recognising that this was part of a once vast wet landscape covering several thousand square kilometres of East England. And the Ancholme Valley is particularly interesting because it's drained in the late 1600s with a river strained to run due north and to discharge to the Humber estuary. So the river is still there, it's still intact. You can actually go and see it today. Well, you have to be quick because it's turning dark, but the valley and the wider countryside developed into rich farming with community and nature at its heart. So we had this transformation to a landscape that you now recognise and would identify with. But that's dramatically different from what was there before. And we've had that since 1670, 1680-ish, but it's changed dramatically during the 1800s and then hugely during the 20th century. And now there's a further challenge. Climate change, sea level rise, increased flood risk, both frequency and intensity, ecological extinctions, and soil loss and degradation threatening major change. The Ancholme is incredibly at risk. If anybody actually lives within the sort of flood area of the valley, you will know what I'm talking about, because it's not much above sea level. Quite large areas of the Humber levels are now below sea level. Quite large areas of the fenlands, the southern fens, are below sea level. So climate change and sea level rise, they are changing the way that we view the landscape, the way that we can possibly use the landscape. This is the modern river, and it's glorious. I mean, it is amazing. Although when we went out there to look at the Broughton Decoy, which we'll come on to in a bit, we hardly saw any birds along the river. It was really very, very strange. There's a few mallard, a few mute swans. I think we saw a coot, no, moorhen. I don't think we saw a coot. But really, in terms of the bird life, it wasn't great. For me, as a bird watcher, you start thinking, well, what's going on? Also, when you're in that landscape, you are aware of being low down and very, very flat. So the landscape is vulnerable to major change. We've also got a situation which I thought was quite a hook. I know the lottery was very interested in this, in that we have wider economic issues in the region. Scunthorpe and Grimsby are at risk in terms of socio-economic issues, and very vulnerable to some of the key employers. Who knows what's going to happen in the future these days. Long-term decline. And you've got this fantastic landscape with the toe end of the Lincolnshire wolds, the great Humber Head wetlands, and the Ancholme Valley, and yet we have a rural tourism economy which underperforms quite badly. And yet there are many positives. You've got fantastic farming heritage, and we've talked to people who've been out and about, chatted to people who grew up on the farms. There's a unique history, a unique landscape, and it's got amazing potential for wildlife and vibrant local communities. But it's one of these landscapes that needs a vision and it needs a bit of a helping hand. The other thing that you've got, which again, you probably, maybe if you live here, you just take some of this for granted, but you've got excellent transport links into the region. You can actually get here very, very easily. I know we're not supposed to drive places because of climate change, but you can get here remarkably easily, and you can get into this fantastic landscape. And it can be very, very attractive. Things are changing, and we don't always like change, but we need to adapt. There are future challenges, and especially wetter climates and landscape and higher sea level. And talking to quite a number of local landowners and farmers, one of the things I've suggested to them is that we are, because sometimes you get quite a negative response when you say, we want it wetter, we want it wilder. And you say, okay, but in 50 years' time, it's going to be wetter and wilder, whether you like it or not. And the sort of farming that we're doing now will not be possible across exactly the same landscape, or the same footprint as we see today. We need to adapt, and you're better actually adapting now rather than reacting, as we tend to do as a society, to crises when they happen. So we can either work with the changes or against them. And surely it's better to anticipate future scenarios and try to grow this into a more sustainable, resilient countryside and a regional economy that is more resilient than it is now. So adapting to change, working with nature, some lands wetter and many areas farmed differently. In some ways, if we're dealing with farming and farming landscapes, that's not that different from what we've done throughout history. We've adapted, we've changed, we've altered. Now, as an ecologist and landscape historian, I have to say not always for the best. But we are now at a crisis point and a tipping point, and we need to learn from the past and we need to adapt for the future. There's Christine Handley, who runs all of our projects, and she's done a lot of work with Jenny and with Lewis out in the Ancholme. And here is one of the old parts of the river. That's the bank of the new river, but this is part of the old river. And you can actually see the watercourse there. You can trace that on the maps. There's the new river, there's the bridge. And that was a blistering hot day, by the way. That was an absolute scorcher. So we have this vision of a wetter countryside and this is quite important, a vibrant farming economy and community. A wetter Ancholme can be a growth pole for regional leisure and tourism. It can be very, very powerful in the local economy. We already have a really fantastic wildlife resource and we've got attractive countryside. We could just make it a lot better. And there were some experiments done by, and I'm struggling to remember his name, I've known him for years, the countryside officer at North Links, who's recently retired. And he was the one who dragged me into taking on the idea of this project. And he did some re-wetting experiments on local farms along the banks of the Ancholme. And they've got a funding pot called stewardship, environmental stewardship or countryside stewardship, to allow farmers to be paid to re-wet some decent sized areas of land. And the results apparently were kind of off the radar. They were just fantastic. All sorts of species coming in that have not been seen in the area for a long time. The numbers of birds were quite remarkable. Now sadly that experiment ended because the funding ran out, and it was done really for funding, and when the funding stops, the farmer decided to plough it all up again and drain it again. But it did show what was possible, and really the way that we have to go forwards. So the river can be an artery linking the Humber Estuary, the Lincolnshire Wells, the coastal marsh and sand dunes, and the heart of rural Lincolnshire. The Ancholme can be really the connection between so many other fantastic parts of the landscape. And the Lincolnshire landscape more widely is going to have to adapt, it's going to have to change. We are being given directives at quite senior levels in government about going carbon neutral between 2040 and 2050. And local authorities and businesses, including farming, have to become carbon neutral. And with modern systems, that is actually quite a challenge. And especially if you are farming on former peat fen, then you're hemorrhaging carbon into the atmosphere. So there are going to be some big changes, almost beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. The role of the Ancholme Valley can be transformational for the region with enormous benefits to people, nature and economy. So I think there are some stark challenges ahead, but we have to turn that on its head and actually say, okay, these are opportunities, we can actually do something which is really going to bring benefit to this area and to local people. And it's a fantastic place to be. It's different from where, I grew up in the Peak District, at the end of the Pennines, and you come down here and it's a fantastically contrasting landscape. And we get different plants. This is white bryony, something that we don't really see in the Peak area. And bryony, I know people who, sadly no longer with us, but when they were young, so we're talking probably early 20th century, they remember people coming out here and collecting the roots of white bryony. And it was, the roots are a bit sort of parsnippy and stringy, and with a bit of embellishment they can be made to look like mandrake, which is a Mediterranean thing. And they were sold in the market in places, I'm sure in Doncaster and Scunthorpe probably. They're certainly sold in the market in Sheffield, and people bought mandrake, and it wasn't mandrake, it was bryony. And you pull it out. With proper mandrake, you had to have a dog to pull it out of the ground, because the mandrake would scream, and that scream would kill you. But mandrake was very, very sought after, because in the pre-anaesthetic era, in medieval times, for example, if you had an operation, this is what you would get, if anything. If you were poor, you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't have anything. But you would get mandrake, and it would put you into a bit of a coma, whilst a surgeon did what they could to sort out whatever your problem was. But mandrake was very highly sought after, and it was still being used for various medical treatments into the early 20th century. I've got a book at home, published in Sheffield, and it sold something like 90,000 copies in its first issue. And Sheffield was the centre of herbal medicine in England. That's where the main headquarters was. And this book, this wonderful old book, is called Every Man His Own Doctor. And it's things like this that you would be using. And of course the reason was, people couldn't afford to go to the proper doctor. There was no NHS. So let's hope we don't go there again, otherwise you might be pulling up mandrake again. So, you come out here and you find these plants, and it's a little bit of history. But as I say, people used to come out here and collect bryony and then pass it off, because it looks like a figure of a man. You carve little bits in and leave bits of root, and it can look like a human figure. I don't think you need a dog to pull it out, that's the only thing. So we set out with this idea. We had a problem. Tim Allen, that's it, I'm sure you know Tim, was the countryside officer who suggested this was a really good idea to put into practice some of the things that we have been developing and talking about for 20 years in discussions on rewilding, which is kind of the bigger picture. So the idea of the project was to seek opinions, ideas and partners. The vision harks back to origins at the core of old Lincolnshire. It's not backwards facing. And there's a problem with rewilding sometimes, and the problem is the re. You can't go back. You can understand the past, you can find out how you got to where you are now, and then you go forwards. It is always different from what went before. So, but I realise I've lost that battle. Everyone calls it rewilding. So we've now started, we used to call it wilder visions. We now talk about rewilding. And we would like to see changes over the short term and along the timeline. The vision harks back to old Lincolnshire, say it's got to be, but it's got to be forward facing, it's got to be to a new, vibrant future. And it's challenging. You're looking for a vibrant, positive future, a richer countryside, reflecting farming traditions of a unique region. And everyone can take part. This is one of the other things that we discussed at the launch event at Brig. We had landowners come and visit the displays and talk to us, people who owned large areas of land, people who owned a little bit of land, just people who lived in the village. And basically the message was everyone can get involved. We're not talking about trying to re-wet the entire valley. We're talking about everyone looking up, taking notice and starting to think this is something that we could do. We could change the world for the better I mean, my view of rewilding, there are some people who think rewilding is like rewilding the Highlands of Scotland and that's it. For myself, rewilding starts on the doorstep. We should be rewilding from what we call the window box to mountaintop. So everyone can take part, it's very inclusive. And yes, we need some big landowners to get involved to change things. And it is happening. I mean, in some cases, it's happening surprisingly quickly. Some changes will be large scale and incredibly exciting. Others are low key, modest, and yet equally important. You're looking at something that could be in a backyard, it could be in the school grounds, it could be a community centre, it could be a farm, a bit of a farm, it could be a roadside. So we had a launch at Brig in 2020, just in time to get locked down. And it went really well. I had a tremendous turnout. It was a lovely day, and they had a market. It was a Saturday market, and they had a market in Brig, and it was really quite delightful. And a lot of interest. I went around and talked to different stall holders and people doing local food, local provenance foods and stuff like that. So the project that we put to the lottery was rediscovering and rewilding a lost landscape, Lincolnshire's Ancholme Valley. And the idea is that it leads to potential rewilding. So what we build is an exciting community-led project in this remarkably unique Ancholme Valley, peeling back the layers of history to discover hidden landscape heritage and biodiversity. And part of it is simply, at the first stage, is getting people to appreciate what they know and what they've got. And it's one of these things that is always quite exciting, because you're going to tell people, well, actually your space, your place, your countryside is unique and it's interesting, it's really special. And if you live somewhere, you often take it quite for granted. Our approach combines ecological and historical information with research into memories, reminiscences of recent landscape change, and drainage of once extensive wetlands. You have an amazing history, a unique history, here on the doorstep. And when we've been out and about, Lewis and I went and did some filming around Broughton, and we got chatting to couples who were walking their dog, and they were immediately talking about their memories, their childhoods, their knowledge, their knowledge of local people, local farmers, etc., etc. And we celebrated some of this near the marketplace in Brig. A lovely, lovely place. The approach that we take, and we have a number of different projects where we're working with the lottery and with local groups, is to engage and train community volunteers to undertake historic archive work and landscape history field work. So we work with people and then try to give them the skills to go and do stuff for themselves, to visit the archives, to work with the museums, to go into the landscapes and rediscover the lost landscapes and cultural heritage. We also have, and I'll show some images right at the end, modern mapping and imaging, which just revolutionises what we can do. The idea is to create landscape time slices and then to identify and interpret the past and the present. And with some of the technology now, GPS and LiDAR, we can do some amazing stuff. And we had local people come along who are fantastically knowledgeable about the area, about the archaeology, people collecting portable antiquities and documenting aspects of the area and its wildlife, and of course the Wildlife Trust are involved. The Ancholme was described to me as one of the best rewilding opportunities in lowland England. In fact, by both the National Trust and the RSPB, they said it wasn't just one of the best, it was the best and biggest opportunity in lowland England. I'll come on to that right at the end. It's drained through the 1600s land improvement. You have to be careful that the language that we use when you're reading historical accounts, land improvement, usually for me as an ecologist and landscape historian, is land destruction, is nature destruction. But of course we have to improve it, because otherwise we wouldn't have the lifestyles that we have today, and we wouldn't be able to live in the comfort and eat the foods that that we want to eat. But there are problems. Land improvement involves this landscape being drained through the 1600s. And the idea is to address some of these issues, knowing what's happened historically, knowing what people value, discovering what people value, and then working with local stakeholders to reverse some of the negative socio-economic trends and to be more resilient to environmental changes. So the vision is actually very ambitious, ultimately. But it's combining heritage, biodiversity and landscape to underpin regional growth poles for nature-based tourism, for example. If you go out there and, I mean, it is teeming with wildlife. We went out along the Ancholme a few weeks back and it was full of butterflies. The painted ladies, I think, had just arrived. They'd just come in probably from Europe, and they were there in numbers, and they were stunning. The scope of the area, there's a humber. You can put it onto a photograph and then onto a map. So this is the bigger vision, and it's not street boundaries. This was just my colleague Chris sort of putting in the main drainage area. We actually extend really in a wavy line round the edge, and we tend to be inclusive rather than exclusive. But that's the core area. That's the core area that would have been underwater, and you can see the river running almost straight as an arrow, south to north. So, a little background, past, present, and future of the Ancholme Valley and its surroundings. Working with farmers, landowners and communities to celebrate its past. It's not saying that the past has been a disaster, it has been what it is. It's changed things dramatically and things are going to change. So we have to recognise that, we have to give a nod to the farmers who have worked hard to turn this into a productive landscape, but also recognise that we are going to need to do things differently, whether we like it or not. And the idea is to encourage a richer future, better adapted to climate change and other challenges. In the South Yorkshire part of the region, we've suffered tremendously in the last 20 years. Unprecedented flooding events. And of course that doesn't mean that if you have a 1 in 500 flood, it doesn't mean you're not going to get another one for 500 years. It means the next one is round the corner, because your 1 in 500 return period needs to be recalibrated, and it's now probably a 1 in 20 or something like that. You know, it changes quite dramatically. But it's a rich, you know, despite the changes that we've had and the loss of wildlife habitat, it's still a wonderfully rich area. And the question then is, can we make it even better? Inevitable changes are going to come. So we want to anticipate and adapt rather than wait until forced to respond. And the idea was to bring about improvements at the same time as celebrating farming heritage. I have a slightly uneasy relationship sometimes with some conservation bodies who think the problem is farming and we are the solution. Conservation is the solution. For me, farming is the opportunity, farming is the solution, and I do quite a lot with farmers. And one of the first things I say to them is, you know, it's in your hands. Conservation can't do what we need to do, you can. So we're looking at opportunities to re-wet and rewild wherever possible, and to reconnect our wild side and work with the grain of nature, a richer, more diverse countryside. Now, unfortunately, you're not going to see this very clearly from the back, but I will just read out a few little bits of it. This is from William Dugdale's book, 1772. A real rip-roaring book, this one. The history of embanking and draining of diverse fens and marshes, both in foreign parts and in this kingdom, and of the improvements thereby. That's a real, it should have been I think it probably was a bestseller in its day. And this is the Ancholme, that's the new river. This is the old Ancholme. And you can see there, that's really the floodland. You can see that wider area there. And in the middle to late 1600s, the whole lot is drained. A series of drainage acts, and the new river is created. So, it's a fantastic document. This covers drainage of fens and bogs across the whole of England. It's not just Ancholme. But I've put this in so you get an idea of why people were doing what they did historically. This is for the common benefit of the whole county of Lincoln. If the course of that river, in other words the Ancholme, obstructed in part in diverse places from Bishopsbrig to the River Humber, were open. And they further said that this means not only the meadows and pastures will be drained, but that ships and boats laden with corn and other things might then more commodiously pass with corn and other things from the said River Humber into the parts of Lindley than they at that time could do, and as they had done formerly. So they're selling this, that look, straighten the river, turn into a canal, and it will bring you wealth and prospects to this region. The king being informed that the channel of the said river Ancholme from Bishopsbrig to the bridge at Ferriby, which ought and had wont to be 40 feet broad, was then grown so narrow for fault of cleaning and scouring, in that some places it extended not to 3 feet in breadth, so that a great part of the adjacent lands were thereby frequently overflowed and drowned, and that men and cattle passing over Glouthford Brig in the time of such floods were seldom out of danger. So that's the other thing, is the river's not functioning. This sounds like the argument about flooding in Somerset in 2013. It needs scouring. You've got to scour it. And then the next bit is to John de Hotham of Bondi Jr., Richard Paynell, William de Skipworth, John de Archers, Ralph de Redford, John Coken, for scouring the said channel from Glouthford Brig to the River of Humber to the breadth of 40 feet, as it ought and want to be, as also of the sewers, the drains, betwixt Eltham and Ferriby, and to make inquiry concerning certain new sewers made from the said town of Eltham to Ferriby by some of the inhabitants of those parts, by their own authority, which had occasioned much overflowing of the waters thereabouts. In other words, they're also pointing their finger at other people that have gone and done their own drainage and now tipping their drainage water into the Ancholme. And the answer is to create the new river, the new 40-foot canal. Now, I'll just mention this one very briefly. The reason I put Robert van der Milt, and you may have had Robert come and talk to you in the past, Robert ran a whole series of projects from University of Hull on the wetlands and wet landscapes around the Humber, and wrote a huge book on the Ancholme Valley. So one of the things is we do know an awful lot about the archaeology and the wetland history of this area because of this particular chap. He's now one of the great and the good. Last time I had contact with him, he had become an acting vice-chancellor at the university. So it's probably too rarefied now to come and talk to the group. But he talks about the drainage from the 13th century, and then the cutting of the new Ancholme, and the first tidal sluice at South Ferriby on the Humber estuary in the 17th century. So we're talking mid-1600s to late 1600s. But this is, and again, this is important. So sorry for all the words, but however, it's not until the introduction of pumps that could overcome the limitations of gravity drainage that the Ancholme levels were effectively drained. And in the 20th century, the Ancholme levels have been transformed into an arable-dominated landscape with underfield drains omnipresent. Now that's the key thing to remember from that, because you can't actually drain a flat landscape very easily until you can pump the water off, because it's got nowhere to flow. So even though they put the new river in, even though they put new sewers or new drains in, it was still predominantly wet. And it would then start to dry out during the 1800s with steam pumps, and then oil-powered pumps, and then by the mid-20th century, electrical pumps. So you suddenly see a revolution, that change. And it's that changes it into the arable-dominated landscape that you see today. You couldn't have had that 200 years ago because you couldn't get the water off. The Ancholme levels are up to 8 kilometres wide, with a big Danishford bridge. Halfway down the valley there is a natural constriction of the floodplain to just about 500 metres. So we know from Robert's work that we know an awful lot about it, but we also have this detailed account that I showed you earlier. And you can zoom in on this. We'll put this up online so you can have a look if you want in your own time. It really is. It gives fantastic detail because it's got the new river that's been cut, and it's got the route of the old river. You can call it the old river. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And this can now be underpinned by modern LiDAR, so light imaging radar and GPS type work, so we can get a good idea of what's actually happening here. And I put this up because I like that. That is called Winterton Piddle Creek. I take it the map maker wasn't impressed. So we've got this fantastic river. We know pretty much what happened to it. We know when it happened. And from a bigger picture, it's a really interesting example of early drainage, converting land to now mostly low-grade farmland. Increasingly it was from inland flooding, sea level incursions and salinification, so salt and things like that. Some of it is relatively high grade, but at a cost. You're having to pump water off, you're having to put nutrients in, and it's going to be more difficult to maintain that. Some of the experiments have shown fantastic recovery of species, and it can be relatively easy. The experiments that Tim Allen was involved with show that you can actually re-wet bits without wetting the whole valley, so that's good, because farmers get very, very jittery if the neighbours are re-wetting their bits. Is the water going to come onto my land? Well, it looks like the valley has what we call hydrological cells, so you can re-wet one bit and it doesn't necessarily affect the others. And with even a modest improvement, you could start to have huge numbers of birds coming back, egrets, herons, etc., etc. It's a really rich landscape. I mean, we've just seen some roe deer as we came down the motorway tonight, and when we've been out on site, you get fantastic views of the roe deer. They're not always that keen on us being so nearby. And we also had this wonderful fox when we were out there. I think it's quite a young one, and it kind of it stopped and looked at us. We looked at it, and then it spotted something, and it crouches down, and then it ran off. And now the last photograph, you can see it's carrying something. So I don't know if it got a pigeon or something like that through the long grass. But it's sort of just gazing at us, like, what are you doing here? And sorry, this is a dead mole, yes. It's the only mole picture I've got. The first, actually, I did once see a live mole, but that was when I was about 7 years old in our local park, and this mole sort of scurried along the ground, which is quite exciting. But all the others I've seen since then, sadly, are above ground and dead. But we had we went for a walk, and we saw loads and loads of really interesting wildlife. The other thing I want to share with you, I'll put this out at the break, I've got it with me, the Ancholme brandy bottle. Now I know you're friends of a museum, so you appreciate artefacts and things like that. But one of the things that come out from the project are the commonplace, the everyday, people's memories, people's childhoods, people's thoughts, people's attachments. But what we had here was a bottle, a bit of glass, which Lewis and Jenny found in with some material that had been taken out of one of the drainage ditches to the side of the Ancholme. And this is what it looks like. And it turns out that it's probably manufactured in the Low Countries. It's quite prestigious. It's got a sort of squarish bottom. This is it's a liquor bottle, basically. It's a brandy bottle, and that's the bulb that goes into the bottle at the bottom, and the rest of it is being broken off. But from the markings, you can see the markings on the side. That suggests that the sheen on those suggests a recent fracture, which we suggest has been when it's taken out of the drain by a digger. So it's been smashed, dumped on the side. But interestingly, this is manufactured in the Low Country for brandy. It has a sort of series of straight edges around the side, so the bottles were stored, and it helped make sure the bottles don't roll in transport by ship. And it was manufactured probably in the late 1600s. So I imagine a Dutch drainage engineer celebrating finishing one of these ditches, one of these drains, getting out a bottle of Flemish brandy, because they're very into brandies in France and the Low Countries, and then throwing the bottle into the ditch, later to be found by Lewis and Jenny. And the reason I mention that is that sometimes it's simple little things that can help tell a story. That actually sort of gives you maybe one of the people that was involved in this huge transformation that we've been talking about. So simple as that. I'm going to finish the first half with a little bit about the decoys and the marshes, because this is the Broughton decoy. Some of you will have been there, no doubt. And we went out to film it, and there'll be a load of stuff up on, is it on Facebook?
Yeah, Facebook and our YouTube channel.
Facebook and YouTube. There's some cards out on the table over there which give you our internet details and our website, and there are links to loads and loads of material that have been produced by Jenny and by Lewis, and there will be a walkover including aerial footage from a drone that we flew over the decoy with the landowner's permission. So there's a whole load of stuff that will come out. Not all of it's up yet, but do have a look on the website, and there will be more to look at very shortly. But Broughton decoy is really interesting. I mean, I know there's the Ashby decoy near to where we are tonight. And being interested in fenlands, I'm really interested in things like decoys and decoy ponds. But this is an absolute cracker. The thing is, when you get there on site, it's actually quite dry, and it's a bit bashed about a bit. I'll show you a picture right at the end, and it actually looks more intact from above than it does when you're on site. But you can see that's one of the arms of the decoy there, and this is the boundary drain here, that's around the outside of the decoy. Now, Decoy Pond is a wet area specially designed to catch duck, so you've got either pinion duck or wooden artificial ducks to draw the wild ducks down, then you drive them into nets to catch them. And this decoy is operating probably sometime from the 1500s into the 1700s, into the early 1800s. When this operating, that must have been, this is the surrounding farmland, that's a deep ditch and it's bone dry, and yet this must have been, the water level must have been well over here and coming into the decoy. So this is a marker for landscape change. What remains is an island with woodland indicator species and things in the middle of a sea of quite intensive farming. But very, very interesting biodiversity, all sorts of stuff happening in this decoy. But the thing with the decoy is it does tell us a story about the drainage, because the decoy is in operation until the early 1800s. It must have been a wet landscape. It must still have been wet, despite the new river being cut through. And of course that links to the point I made before, that you can't actually drain the bigger landscape until you've got pumps to do it. That's what the pool would have looked like. So there's photographs which don't show very well, showing some of these arms here. That's the open water, and then that would have nets like that, and it would drive the birds along, and they would be caught. And there's the decoy man with his catch, which would then be dispatched to the local market town. And by the mid-1800s, we're going to London by train from Ashby. Huge number in the 1800s. So, the point there is that there's the Ancholme brandy bottle. It tells you about the minute detail that can tell you a story. You can pick that up. And I know Lewis has been doing some stuff with local archaeologists, even digging up things in people's back gardens, just to get them into the idea of what you can find on your doorstep. And sometimes it tells a remarkable story. Very often you get things that are almost meaningless. I had someone recently who was very excited because there's a quite nasty housing development proposed on their local site, and they found this treasure trove of bits of pottery and workstone and all sorts. And not only that, they found a long, thin piece of metal with a little bit of metal sticking out the end. It looks like a Saxon sword. They were very, very excited until I showed it to a real archaeologist who said, yeah, it's just early industrial stuff. Anywhere that's got settlement, you'll have a whole pile of that. That's a metal strap, probably from a bucket. Oh, very sad. But so you've got the decoy tells the story. We can go there, we can look at it. It's touching history. We know when it started. We even know something about the people that lived in the Decoy farm nearby, and we know when the decoy finished. I think it's like 1847, and that is when the landscape is drying up. So you can use that information. Not only is the decoy itself a fantastic thing to have on the doorstep, because most decoys are gone, but it also helps tell the story. It helps unravel the past, and it then becomes important in informing the future vision. So we'll take a 10 or 15 minute break, and I can take any questions now if people want to, or we can save questions right at the end. Or come and talk to me over the interval. Okay. At the front, the little brandy bottle that we have the fragment of it. So if you want to have a look, please handle it very carefully. It is glass. It doesn't look like glass, but it is glass. And then we've just been told a place name. Was it Brandy Wharf?
Yeah.
And people who did the drainage were largely Dutch, Flemish, and possibly from the French lowlands. They were the ones that would have been involved in draining the valley in the first place in the 1600s, as they did both the northern and the southern fen, and they wanted brandy. So Brandy Wharf is probably the wharf into which those ships came up the new canal, delivering goodies from the continent.
Yeah.
Because I suspect British brandy was a bit...
I think also it's possibly smuggled in because South Ferriby was almost recruited.
It's a very dodgy area, I didn't want to mention that. Can we have the lights down, please? Okay, so we took out the Ancholme, but as I said earlier, I take the wider vision of the wider valley, and that includes the woodlands and the wolds to either side. So we've got Broughton Woods. A fantastic site, absolutely delightful with the herb Paris. I've actually got a patch like this in my back garden in Sheffield, but it's not in a naturalistic setting. I suspect that sometime, because we've got an old oak tree as well, and archaeologists in years to come, plant archaeologists will discover this rare plant and think my garden was an ancient woodland. It's a gorgeous woodland, the early purple orchids. And of course this is always a difficult one when you're trying to explain to beginners, a white early purple orchid. But absolutely delightful, and fantastic old coppice trees, coppice limes. And yes, species rich, it's biodiverse. And you have to think, oh yeah, could we have more, could there be more areas that in the future develop into this sort of landscape? And I put this in because my other passion, if you like, is it's landscape history as well as ecology. And I'm sure you all noticed that massive bank and ditch running across there, and that footpath in Broughton Wood, and there's something else happening across there. Just in a casual walk through, Lewis and I found charcoal hearths, banks, ditches, trackways, all sorts of features. It's a really, really rich site. Fantastic. And it's got all the indicators of an ancient woodland, the mysterious herb Paris, but then Dog's Mercury, and this is the female version. In Sheffield we tend to get monosex clones of just the male, but there you've got the female plant as well, and you've got both male and female. So that was really quite interesting to see. And then you drop down towards the river, and on a hot summer day, it's a stunning landscape. I was surprised by two things. One, as I said earlier, was the lack of aquatic bird life, and I suspect that's in part due to the you go from the river straight into quite intensive arable in a lot of areas, so there's no kind of hideaway habitat for a lot of things. But the other thing that surprised me is we didn't see a single boat. And I was like, this is really strange. So, water tourism, if you like, water leisure is a huge thing, and yet we were there and didn't see anybody at all. Oh, and this is one of my favourites. You all recognise that even at a distance. Himalayan balsam. Yes. Yes, everywhere. All part of what we call a recombinant ecology. And we can look one way across the valley. You can see how flat the floodplain is, and then we've got the wolds on one side and the woods on the other. But there's a problem. That's a farmer doing what farmers do, and they're fine. They're a good farmer. That may even be the one that gave us permission to go on site. But all that dust is soil that's blowing away. And I actually posted this up on my Twitter. With lockdown, I took to Twitter, so that was quite exciting, having avoided it like the plague for about 10 years. And a local resident emailed me and said, or put a comment up saying, I think it's all landed in my back garden. Someone living over the other side, it was all playing, said, yes, I've picked this up, it's all landing up, yeah. And there's a problem. And it's one that we don't want to address. I mean, I'm actually working with some of the authorities across the region, in particular the Doncaster District Council, looking at the lost northern fenland. If you're on peat fen, all this is a depth of peat soil. That's a drainage ditch, and it's almost bone dry, and that is about, what was it, Lewis, about 2-3 metres easily?
Yeah, at least.
So you drop the water level would have been somewhere up here, and it's now somewhere down here. And everything in between is probably peaty, that's carbon, and it's shrinking, because if you get, if you stop a fenland site being waterlogged, the air gets in and it breaks down. So we have a big problem. It's a breadbasket landscape. We all depend on this for our cheap food. But how sustainable is it? So, we may need to think quite harshly about some things we're doing. We were down here where this pump is, and it's really weird. You're walking along, then suddenly this huge noise kicks off. What on earth is going on? Then the water starts to bubble. This was a scorching hot day in the middle of a drought, and they're still pumping water off the land. And you kind of think, well, I don't know, it's rather strange. I'm sure there's a logic behind it, but none of us could actually work out quite what that logic entailed. And some of the drains and the channels adjacent, one of them was the old river that you could see on those early maps that I showed you, but also you've got this one nearby, which I think is a drain, going under in a sluice and into the river. The big pump is on the other bank. But it's a gorgeous habitat. It's absolutely amazing habitat with all sorts of stuff in there. And it's full of dragonflies. I've never seen so many dragonflies. And one of the things about the Ancholme is that because of where it is, if we're looking at this as a rewilding type possibility, at least in part, you're actually quite close to the east coast. And with climate changing, there's going to be a lot of interesting dragonflies moving over from Europe. And if I were looking, I know the British Dragonfly Society were quite interested in this idea, if you were looking for somewhere to really encourage dragonflies with new, modestly sized wetlands and other features, then this would be one to look at. And similarly, when they had the experimental re-wetting a few years ago, they got very good numbers of all sorts of things like egrets, which are coming in from the continent as well. So there's loads and loads of opportunities, and that was just absolutely heaving with dragonflies and damselflies. It was really quite remarkable. And in some cases, it's just a matter of stopping, pausing and looking, which we don't always do. So absolutely fantastic habitat. And you've got some really good habitats not that far away, not as far as the dragonfly flies, if you think of it like that. Thorn Moors is a wonderful site for dragonflies, which is where I photographed this black darter on someone's shoulder, actually, just sat there. It was in November, so it was probably a bit colder than it would normally expect, and it was a bit dozy, and it just sat on people, which afforded a few good opportunities for photographs. And there will be others, damselflies, dragonflies, banded demoiselles, beautiful demoiselles, wonderful, evocative names. And they're arriving. I mean, our rivers around South Yorkshire, we didn't get banded demoiselle until about 20 years ago. Now on every stream, just about, you can't move for them. And beautiful demoiselle will be next, I'm sure. One of the things I was interested in, I have to say I failed absolutely to get any traction with Rewilding Britain on this, was I thought the project could make a unique difference to engage poorer communities in rewilding and associated benefits. And the benefits from things like health and fitness through to economy and education. And it's something, being in education myself, it's something that I'm quite passionate about, how we actually extend those benefits to a much wider audience. And I think very often rewilding projects are rather exclusive, and I thought here we could make a real difference to the biodiversity, to the landscape, to the people, and also to those other communities. Now, I mentioned this, the potential to do things with data, really quite interesting, because that's LiDAR, light imaging and radar, and ranging rather. That little thing is the decoy, and you can actually see the corners of the decoy pipes there. So this is actually looking at, so that's the floodplain there, and you can see the old river there, you can see drains. With LiDAR, if you've got the professional, there's different levels. There's free to access ones which are okay-ish, but the ones that you pay for can get you down to a few centimetres. And they can pick up a tiny difference in elevation in the land. And you can also play around with the system. So if we looked at, say, Broughton Woods, you can actually remove all the trees by computer and look at all the archaeology and everything under the trees. I say one can. I have a little man who can do it. I can't do it. But this is the potential, we can actually start to play around with this. You can also overlay things like those old maps, as I showed you, and you can what we call geo-reference them, because they're quite accurately done. Some of the old map makers at that stage were pretty good, and you can actually link those to modern maps by geo-referencing. So you can actually overlay your historic map onto a modern map and actually see where all these things are. So you can actually go out and then look at where we know the river used to be and see what's there now, things like that. Really quite exciting. We haven't got it yet, but we will have for you, and we'll make sure that you know about it when it's done. We have a computer program where we can actually create an what's the word? You can fly over the valley, basically, and you can fly over it at different times. So you will be able to fly over the Ancholme Valley in 1600. Now I understand that is problematic because you couldn't fly in 1600, but just ignore that. You will get a bird's eye view, and I think we're doing it something like 1600, immediately after drainage, and then kind of in the 20th century. So you'll be able to fly over the valley with a recreated landscape. We've done one for a lost airfield in South Sheffield, near where I live. It was a World War I airfield, which, had life gone differently, it would have become the equivalent of Manchester Airport. It didn't, fortunately, otherwise I wouldn't have to live where I live. But you can actually fly, you can take off in a Sopwith camel. If anyone remembers Biggles, that's what Biggles used to fly in. And you can fly over the landscape, and you can see the trees and the fields and the buildings, and you can go around and you can actually experience it. And if you were clever, like if any of you have got grandchildren or kids who are into computers, then they will know all about virtual reality and headsets. You can actually pilot the thing yourself if you do that. So that will be coming shortly. We'll have all that online as well. My feeling for the Ancholme is that there's going to be change. Whatever, life is like that, and at the moment things are changing almost so fast we can barely keep up. But I think with the Ancholme there's huge potential. There's major opportunities to do something really absolutely dramatically exciting. But at the moment it's largely untapped. The project in its present form is coming to a close this December, and we will have a closing event sometime in the autumn. And at the very least, at the moment, it's helped to kickstart initiatives from the larger agencies and the NGOs, led, I'd say, by the Links Wildlife Trust. And they had various ideas about reviewing the flooding and the hydrology of the Ancholme, and then it had never really happened. And I think as a consequence of us buzzing around trying to get people interested, they've started to set up committees of the great and the good, and these things then churn through developing strategies and all the rest of it. So at least that will be starting to happen. There are some problems. These things are never easy, and what we're hoping to, at the very least, is to try to provide some sort of a vision, if you like, a statement that things are going to change. Let's plan it, let's adapt, and let's celebrate what a wonderful landscape this is, but also let's think about how it needs to be in the future. There are issues. We had some problems, and I'm not going to say in detail because it would be inappropriate, but various promises were made about quite substantial funding to take the project to a higher level, even at this early stage, and a lot of those promises didn't come through, which is rather unfortunate. Because actually the value that we would get from starting to do some of the work, we've got a lot of landowners and farmers and others and community groups, the Low Villages Forum, people like that, a lot of people interested, and it doesn't take a huge amount of funding to actually start to turn things into action. Some of it can be very modest, some of it could be quite exciting and quite innovative, quite large scale. We've got farmers who come and say, well, I farm the area, but I've got a business doing something else and I still want to keep my farm, but I don't want to be farming it every day. Could I rewild? And the answer is yes, you could. And especially when we had the floods the other year, then a lot of people saying, oh, yeah, maybe we need to do something differently to hold the water back. Government initiatives are talking about slowing the flow. They're talking about paying farmers to hold back water. They are now seriously talking about paying farmers to hold carbon. And local authorities and businesses are looking at how on earth they can do things to improve their carbon efficiency, but beyond that they have to really find ways of paying somebody else to mop up carbon for them. So there's suddenly opportunities for people to re-wet landscapes, because it starts to hold carbon back. It also, in drained peatlands, stops you losing more carbon. So it's a double win. So there are, some really big things happening, and there's a lot of concern about biodiversity extinction and loss of species, etc. And here you've got somewhere that could be absolutely transformational. If you take it from the Humber to Market Raising, it's a big, big area. Fantastic history, wonderful wildlife. It could be absolutely brilliant. There's also a divergence of approaches, and again I can't really say too much about this, but I was approached initially by some major conservation organisations saying this is a fantastic opportunity to rewild and re-wet the Ancholme Valley. And my reaction was, yes it is, and the first people we need to talk to will be farmers and communities, and then to engage with people and look at what they want and what's possible. And some of the larger conservation bodies actually wanted to simply acquire the bulk of the valley and flood it. And I thought, that isn't really doing what I'm talking about, and it's inappropriate, and it would be hugely unpopular. It's what farmers dread. That's what they think conservation is. They dread that sort of conservation. But what we were saying, we want to work from the bottom up with communities, with farming, to actually almost softly rewild, re-wet where appropriate. And because I had that, it took ages to winkle this out to one organisation who said, well, we're not going to join you in this because we have a fundamental difference in approach. And I said, well, what do you mean? We just see it differently. And what it was, I wanted to talk to farmers and communities and work with them, and the bigger organisations simply wanted the whole thing to be floodland. So, and that's, if you read any of the media, rewilding is full of all sorts of contradictions and arguments, sometimes very, very deeply held, profoundly, strongly held views. And there are different types of rewilding, and they don't like each other. It's quite funny. Some of them like grazing animals, some of them don't like grazing animals. So, for one group, you want grazing animals as in Netcastle in Sussex. And it's the grazing animals that drive the ecological processes, and it's been absolutely brilliant. And then others say, we don't let nature be free-willed. I don't want to divert too much on this, but it's an interesting concept, because I did show you a picture of Himalayan balsam, and that's one of the things you get if it is free-willed. Let nature be free-willed, and you will get lots and lots of really exciting ecological species. It won't necessarily be what you thought you were going to get. If you think of all the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust nature reserves, a lot of those require very careful management to deliver the biodiversity. If you let nature be free will, then you are prepared to walk away and not manage anything. And in many cases it will be disastrous. But these all go under the idea of rewilding. I just wanted to close with a few thoughts about rewilding writ broad. Ancholme, I still think is probably one of the finest opportunities in lowland England to have a rewilding project. I think what we'd be looking at is something that happens in a gradual, piecemeal way, which celebrates the communities, works with farmers, grows vibrant communities, certainly doesn't displace communities, and also then triggers a dramatic revival. I mean, it could be absolutely off the screen in terms of the spectacular wildlife that we would get here. And that could be done. And it could be done relatively easily, relatively modestly. And as I say, one of the things I start out with is it's going to happen Anyway, so we need to embrace it, work as a community, farmers, non-farmers, townies, country folk, whatever. We need a different way of doing things. There's lots more on the website. There's a link to the Ancholme. There's videos, podcasts, workshops, virtual flyover, etc. And we are now looking at the next steps. We have ideas for what we call a wood pasture meadow in every parish, which the lottery like the idea of. So small scale rewilding initiatives at a community level. And we're also doing a project, we hope, to rediscover the lost willow landscapes. We found some fantastic old willow trees in and around the Humber levels. And some of these are the biggest willows ever found in Britain. And no one's noticed, and some of the farmers are still knocking them over. So we want a project to rediscover that. And then just to close with, one of the things that would make the Ancholme special would be, if I were putting a claim for it as a wildlife site, probably would be the dragonflies and damselflies that we could get back. They're already there in really good numbers, and we could do a fantastic job. And with climate change, which is happening, some people don't agree, but it is happening. We are getting hotter, longer summers. There will be more dragonflies coming back. And the idea of rewilding or renaturing can take place almost anywhere. We were on the, Lewis can help me here, the link road, I think, to the Humber Bridge, and there's a glorious roadside near a roundabout. Lewis, what was the road?
Barton upon Humber, that roundabout near the...
With, the most amazing pyramidal orchid displays that you'll ever see. Now just imagine if all the roadsides on all those new roads that have been cut through the landscape, if all those could be populated by wildflowers and orchid meadows and butterflies, we could start to transform areas dramatically, and you form corridors that link different bits together. And if you talk to community groups, churches, schools, farmers, landowners, could they set aside a little bit of land? Could they create a new meadow? Could they plant up a new bit of woodland? Could they create a new pond? Could they create a marsh? What could we do? And if you start to join at the bits, softly you build up impetus and you engage people, and it could be absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, fine.
Has anybody got any questions? Oh,
You haven't actually said any physical work there type thing. Is the idea for each areas to do patchwork thing, or are you actually physically going to reinstate the river?
I think really the river as it is has to function as it does. There may be issues ultimately of where it intersects with the Humber and what happens at that end, some way down the line with rising sea level. But the river as a canalised river, there's not an awful lot you can do without causing a lot of grief.
I didn't know whether you were thinking of actually bringing it back as a meandering river rather than a canal.
The meanders still exist throughout a lot of the landscape, and it would be possible that part of our original concept, and this is where we were told that there would be funding to do the work, was to do specialist hydrological assessment, to look at all the catchment on those old maps, and then to look at each bit and see what was making them work or not work in terms of water management. Now, we didn't get the funding to do that, and that is fundamental to actually doing any reinstatement work. I don't think you could ever, at the moment, I don't think you could ever feasibly take the new river out of its present watercourse. However, there are huge opportunities to re-wet the landscape on either side of the river. And in fact, when we look at the historic precedent, the things I talked about earlier, we know that that landscape was still wet up to the mid-1800s, because the decoy was still functioning. So it had been there for nearly 200 years. It has still been wet, even after the new river was put in. So I think that is relatively straightforward, and we think each of those hydrological bits of land is what we call a cell. It's an isolated hydrology, so you can re-wet one bit without risking flooding another. So if you're one farmer and you're another farmer, and you say, I want to re-wet my land, it wouldn't necessarily spill over into your land. So that is really quite an advantageous point of view. But before you can do anything properly, you need to model the water and where the flows are going to be. And obviously one of the issues is that you don't want to risk making any flood risk worse than it is already in some areas. So we have to approach this in a softer way. However, with the funding streams have been changing almost beyond recognition in the last couple of years. So there will be funding for farmers to manage water, to manage biodiversity, to manage carbon, and that opens up opportunities. So I would imagine a patchwork. If you can imagine taking the view from above the Ancholme, with the river as it is, a straight river now, and then imagine new wetlands emerging on either side, gradually in a piecemeal way. And one of the habitats we would love to see re-established was probably quite widespread historically, which is a wet woodland of willow and alder in quite large areas.
I was born in Scunthorpe and then I now live in Hibblestone, and I fished the River Ancholme all my life to bring very intensely at Scunthorpe Cars and Harlem Hill Lock area. Do you have any thoughts on how your scheme would affect or improve or just keep as is the fishing? It's not as good by the way as it used to be. It was a bream river.
All right.
A lot of bream were caught in that.
So how long ago was that?
Well, when I was a young boy, the Sheffield people came by bus
Yeah,
to
yeah.
Scunthorpe Cars, and a friend of my mother's gave them tea and sandwiches in the matches, and you couldn't get a peg from Brown's Bridge at Scunthorpe Cars to Brandywall. It was dead out on Sunday afternoon, it was good. And people netted up with bream, but latterly, I don't know, 20 years ago, we caught lots of good roach. In 1976, we caught a lot of roach. It was a hot summer, and they went on to hemp and tares. And everyone I spoke to, because I drove down the bank and chatted to them as I went down, they were bagging up with lots of roach. But then gradually over the years, no offence, nitrates, I've run a track like at Kirkminster for years.
It's run off.
Things and run off.
Yeah, you see.
The
So,
water when we were piking went dark blue. Not a blue, a nice blue, it was a kind of a funny shade of blue. And then went to pH and had a test kit.
Yeah.
And I worked for Angling Water as a draftsman one time. They take me off, but over the years it's changed a bit. But there's still fish in the river. People don't go down there much now, maybe I'll go down. But I don't see hardly anybody.
well, if you look across the landscape, you'll see, lots of the fields are right up to the ditch, right up to the hedgerow. Some of the farmers now starting to put conservation headlands in and things like that, which will take out some of the runoff. But you've still got a very badly affected soil, lots of nutrients. Nutrients put on in the past, not so much now, but nutrients in the past were thrown on in a form that could easily be washed straight off again. Which makes no sense because you're paying a huge amount for fertiliser that ends up in the stream, pollutes the ditch, pollutes the river, and then it's changing your fish fauna because they can't cope. So I would think what I've been suggesting would actually start to reverse that, because you have larger areas of valley bottom marshland and wetland to take out those nutrients again. And some of it might actually be put in deliberately to clean that water, to actually do that. So that's what you would hope, and then you would gradually get an improvement in the main water course, and hopefully some of those fish would come back. You have to be positive about these things, because Sheffield, when I was a kid, I grew up, the River Don had no fish. Well, we had mutant sticklebacks with 5 eyes and things. Had no actual normal fish at all. We now got salmon. And I write for local newspapers, and I had someone about 2 years ago write to me and say, I'm really concerned, Ian, because I've seen these things, I think these are salmon, they sent me photographs, near Stocksbridge, which is the top end of the Don, but they're dead, they're dying. I said that's not bad news, that's brilliant. They're spawned. And 99% of salmon when they spawn die. So we've got something like 15 species of fish back, including salmon, which is fantastic. Oh, and we've got otters. We've got otters in the middle of Sheffield.
He fishes behind a football stadium in Sheffield.
Yeah.
He lives in Birmingham, and he's a trout fisherman like I.
Yeah.
And he does good. Well, they catch brown trout right behind the football stadium.
That's near the Wednesday ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, I've always described the Wednesday ground as very good off-channel storage for water. I'm a Sheffield United fan.
Just changing from fishing, the farmers have always said they strike a car oak, in the land with the deep ploughing. So the theory was that maybe there was oak, forest, I don't know,
They tend to call them bog oaks, even though a lot of them are not.
Yeah, they've got different names. Right?
A lot of them are other species. So they're generically called bog oak, but they're not always necessarily oak trees.
Right.
But I mean, there were huge numbers of trees around Thorn Moors, for example. You can see them in some of the fields where farmers have ripped them out of the bog and then just left them. In North America, there would be a national monument because it's all part of the prehistoric forest that cover this landscape. So,
What about eels? Do they still get eels in the... When we started boating 50 years ago on the Ancholme, there were eels then.
yeah. I mean, eels, like I implied earlier, they almost got to the point of being extinct. The RSPB at places like the Old Moor Nature Reserve on the River Dern in Barnsley have had a big eel reintroduction programme. So hopefully that will pay off because the eels go all the way to the Sargasso Sea and back again.
Yes,
So they're one of these species that goes in, to freshwater and seawater. So hopefully they will come back. But what they really want is the sort of landscapes I've been describing, where you've got bits of pools and little bits of ponds and wet meadows and bits of wet pasture and bits of marshland in a more intimate landscape. What we tend to have now, with sort of 50 years or so of really intensive farming, is a simplified landscape. You get big chunks of arable, big chunks of different bits, but you don't get that intimate landscape that we had. If you were here in, say, 1700, when the new river would have been cut in, but you'd still be stood in a landscape that was some arable where it was better drained, because everyone has to have arable, and you need to grow oats to feed your animals, because everything is animal powered. And you would have hay meadows and bits of wet pasture and bits of willow carr and alder carr. And you needed the bits of woodland because you needed wood for fuel and you needed wood for structural work and for making tools and equipment. So, every village, every farm would have little bits of that intimate landscape. And of course what we've done is simplify the whole thing and removed it all. But hopefully the eels will come back.
Did you have any eels when you were...
Yeah, it's just strange. We don't catch a lot there.
No.
The river trout's good for eels.
Can I just ask what the general reaction has been from the farmers and landowners regarding it?
Very positive, actually. I mean, this is sort of with the wider idea of rewilding, which in itself I haven't got time tonight to go into detail, but there are some really deep schisms, if you like, between different groups. And we tend to have meetings which try and bring everybody together, but we're getting individual farmers coming to meetings saying, I've been a really successful farmer, I'm looking back at what I'm now going to hang on to my children and I don't like it. I don't think I've done, I've been very successful, but I've actually done a lot of damage and I want to find a way of I want to farm. I don't want to be a countryside custodian, I want to be a farmer, but I want to actually do it differently and better. And we had, just before lockdown, we had a big rewilding conference, and for the first time we had probably about 10 of the big landed estates turn up. And we weren't just getting the forester or the estate manager, we were getting the owners coming to take part in a conversation, in a discussion about how could they do things differently. And there's some very exciting projects happening in and around Lincolnshire. And I just happen to think that the Ancholme is a huge opportunity. then certainly the discussions that Lewis and Jenny have had with farmers and landowners has been very positive, and quite a few of them came to the law and ship break. And as I say, some of them, were saying, well, we could certainly put, some fields or a corner, field corner or stuff like that. We can do things on a modest scale. Some were potentially quite ambitious. There were one or two who were very, what's the word? They weren't very positive about what we were suggesting. I thought one shot was going to have some sort of seizure. But I mean, I've dealt with farmers all my life, and generally you sort of listen and you end up talking and learning, and then they come around to a discussion. And as soon as I was able to say, well, look, we're not talking about removing farming, we're looking at working with farmers to deliver this. You need to be paid to do this, and you'll get huge benefit from it as well. And some of it you're going to have to get used to doing differently. So they were generally quite positive, apart from, there was one particular chap who was really, I thought he wasn't very happy with me. Any last question?
Have you had dealings with the drainage board?
I'm actually, at the moment, I'm not specifically on the Ancholme, but I am looking at a project for Doncaster Council, looking at the wider Humber levels, because they've got a really exciting idea of kind of linking a lot of these things up. And part of that is consulting with the drainage board and I'm trying to remember what they call, there's an overarching body that coordinates the drainage boards, and I do know their chairman. So they're actually some of them are quite friendly. Because historically, for those, I'm sure you all know this, but drainage boards have been very, very influential in farming and water management, and they have not always seen eye to eye with conservation bodies. And one of the routes in bodies like the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB is to acquire land and therefore get involved directly in the drainage boards, so they actually have a voice. And again, this is really sort of laying down the olive branches and saying, well, we want to work together. Farmers, conservation cannot deliver this. Farmers and conservation together have to deliver this. So yes, we want to work with you. So part of my consultation, not on the Ancholme, but on this other project, is talking to the drainage boards and saying, what do you think to it? Because if you haven't got them on board, I've been talking to Wicken Fen and to the Greyfen project. Some of you have been down to there, to Cambridgeshire, to the two big restoration projects. And one of them is still, they've got the land, but it's still dry because the local farmer won't let them re-wet. So if you can't persuade them, you're going to have a real problem. They can hold a trump card and hold you back. Now the Ancholme, I think, we have these sort of hydrological cells within the valley, and you can re-wet one bit and the others will still remain farmable. That's it. Yeah.
In what ways will you re-farm? Because it seems to me that they're all rewilding. If you can't persuade people that you're going to be able to feed the nation, you're not going to win the argument.
Yeah.
So what ways are you suggesting they re-farm?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is to farm, and this isn't meant to be patronising, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, but to farm more cleverly. And we're going to have to do that because of climate change and because of sea level rise and because of flood risk.
You just build bigger banks and put in bigger pumps, huh?
Yeah, and dredge.
I mean, that's the way man's done
yeah.
it before.
Yeah, and what happens every time, because each time, and the last big time I suppose that we did this was probably the 1950s, and every time then everyone thinks we've solved the problem, and then when it fails even bigger than the last time. And when I was doing my research for my Forgotten Fenlands book, and the Lost Fens, I was talking to groups all the way down the Don Valley, down to the Humber, and they all said, oh, my granddad used to have a boat and we thought it was bonkers. And after the 1950s, after the flood defence was put in the 1950s, everyone got rid of their boats. But before that, they knew and they expected, right up into Sheffield, they expected to get flooded several times a year. And then suddenly they think, oh, we solved, problem solved. And you see, if sea level rises as well, and you get increased inland flood risk, then if you pardon the pun, there's a perfect storm brewing. So we have to do something. Now, the Germans and the Dutch, I mean the Dutch in particular, are really good at working cleverly with farming and with water. And they are developing an approach called, I hate these technical terms, but paludiculture. Paludiculture, which is how you farm wetter landscapes. And you know, this is still viable farming to produce food or to produce biomass, and also to draw down grants for carbon and various other things. But it's how you farm a wet landscape, and they are making it work. So the Germans, particularly in former peat fens that have been cut for the peat, horticultural peat industry, and in Holland where they're obviously majorly at risk from flooding, they are coming up with economically viable farming solutions. It may be that in some ways you're looking at wet grassland and pasture, and you're looking at grazing livestock, rather than maybe arable. Arable is a problem in some areas, and its environmental impacts are massive. So we need to think about that, and can we farm arable in a way that's more environmentally friendly? And are there other things? Maybe that we have to farm different areas. And what the farming industry is very, very good at doing in recent years is actually using some of the technology I alluded to with satellite monitoring and remote sensing. So you can now, instead of the fertilisers that all run off like we were talking about earlier, you can actually monitor your crops, and a computer will tell you where to add the fertiliser or where to irrigate, rather than the sort of type of approach that we had in the past. So there are things that we can do to make it much better, easier, but also economically viable. We're going to have to be very imaginative, because we won't have a choice. It's not that, and this is where I disagree with some of the rewiring. They are doing it, I mean it's disparaging it, but it's almost like a plaything. It's not, this is the future, we have to eat. And I very rarely hear people talk about food security when they're talking about these things. You have to find places.
Wouldn't suggest that the population is likely to decrease.
Good comment.
We've also got to be rather careful. We've got to keep the farmers, and we've got to keep producing our own food. I think the present government's policy is we can export this problem by importing cheap food.
Yeah.
But of course, cheap food here means that somebody's intensive somewhere else, and that can be America, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand,
Indonesia,
where places we're making deals with at the moment.
If you look at the palm olive, I mean, I'll not divert into this, but palm olive growth, which I've had people tell me is sustainable forestry in Malaysia and Indonesia, it's completely disastrous, and palm oil gets into loads and loads of food products that you just don't even think about. It's got into the supply chain, and it's hugely damaging. If you take an aerial view or a satellite view over Indonesia and see the forest burning and the smoke, and the communities who are being displaced and driven to extinction as a consequence of sustainable forestry, it's appalling. So, the idea that we can export these problems, I think you're absolutely, totally correct. We can't. We have to take responsibility. And this is why I also, we need to work as a community with farming, with conservation, with other stakeholders to deliver that. And I'm not sure that present governments, any of the present politicians generally understand these issues, really. That's just my humble assessment. I wouldn't know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.